A military helicopter carries Egypt's former leader, Hosni Mubarak, from prison to a military hospital. The country under nighttime curfew. The military once again in control. Mohamed Morsi, Mubarak's successor as president, under house arrest. The Muslim Brotherhood spiritual leader, Mohammed Badir, and over a dozen senior members awaiting trial. And protest marches and funerals day after day. How did Egypt find itself in this state? In this program, we'll tell the 2.5-year story of the events that led to the ousting of a president after 30 years of autocratic rule. The first free and fair elections in the country's history. A new president elected, but deposed 13 months later. And a cycle of violence bringing the country almost to civil war, facing an uncertain future. This is the story of Egypt's unfolding crisis. It starts in December 2010. Mass protests in Tunisia, leading to the toppling of the country's president. Protesters demonstrating over high unemployment, food inflation, corruption, and the denial of political freedoms were met with brutal force at the hands of the police and security forces. Yet after 28 days of continued resistance, President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali was ousted, ending 23 years in power. This televised revolution was watched across the Arab world and triggered a series of similar revolts by equally disaffected populations. This was the Arab Spring. Inspired by the revolution in Tunisia, small networks of Egyptian activists were gearing up for mass action. They'd been agitating against President Mubarak's autocratic rule for years, but they'd never attracted mass support until people saw what they might achieve. Their demands were simple: political freedoms, an end to state corruption, and a better quality of life for an impoverished population.
Anger had been brewing in Egypt for years now. The last 2 years, we witnessed several strikes in the country, rising unemployment, sectarian tension was on the rise.
There were signs that the mass of Egyptian people were becoming increasingly frustrated. The question was whether this was just going to be a social media revolution, or if it would actually bring people out onto the streets. Egyptians had lived under emergency law for the 30 years of Mubarak's rule. Anti-government activity and street demonstrations were heavily monitored, and only approved political parties were allowed. Like Tunisia, the people of Egypt were policed by a multi-layered and complex security service. On the morning of January 25, 2011, people began protest marches around the country, calling for greater freedoms and political change.
The hundreds of people walking to the streets, it's unprecedented for people to march to the streets this way as an act of protest without security trying to prevent them.
In Cairo, scuffles broke out with riot police. Mubarak had always relied on the security forces to quell popular protest, but they gradually became less and less effective. They did clash with protesters in Tahrir Square on Tuesday, 25th of January, and again 3 days later after Friday prayers. They began to feel outnumbered and ultimately withdrew. Then the army, which would play a vital role in the coming weeks and months, moved in. But in a surprise to many, rather than take the president's side, the military emerged as the champions of the people.
From Cairo, we're actually seeing the army on the streets. We're seeing the protesters cheering and welcoming the APCs coming in to the streets of Cairo.
In February 2011, after weeks of protests, Hosni Mubarak stood down.
We're watching state television here now who are running their titles, their preamble. We're seeing a newsreader on the screen right now. We've got a translator across it. Let's listen.
My fellow citizens, at these hard circumstances our country is experiencing, President Mohammed Hosni Mubarak has decided to waive the office of the President of the Republic and instructed the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces to run the affairs of the country. May God guide our steps.
There you go, short but sweet. Hosni Mubarak has gone.
The country was now run by Egypt's military chiefs, the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, known as SCAF, headed by Field Marshal Mohammed Hussein Tantawi. SCAF chose a new prime minister, Essam Sharaf. SCAF had taken power over a volatile populace, representing almost the entire political and religious spectrum. Dissent with their regime was quick to form. SCAF's timeline for its planned elections was unclear, and its tactics in dealing with continued mass protest often heavy-handed, turning the revolutionary movement against them.
I think that Sharaf's government is useless because no matter what he tries to do, it's not his word and it's not his decision. It's always the Supreme Council of Armed Forces.
Protests and demonstrations by different groups were becoming increasingly frequent. The Egyptian people felt they'd fought hard for political change, and so were now determined to pick a new leader. In May 2012, Egyptians went to the polls in the country's first free and fair elections.
But first, we're just 1 hour into a two-day election, an historic moment in Egypt as voters cast their ballots in the country's first ever democratic presidential election. More than a year after the revolution that toppled former President Hosni Mubarak, Egyptians are finally choosing a new leader.
2 rounds of voting brought 13 presidential candidates down to 2.
Egyptians, for the first time, have a real choice in terms of who they want to lead the country. In this election, they're voting for individuals, and it's their first time that they've got the opportunity to actually decide the individual that they want to lead them, what kind of individual they want to be then.
The final runoff was between Ahmed Shafiq, Prime Minister in the dying days of Mubarak's rule, and Mohammed Morsi, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood and a long-serving member of Parliament. By mid-June, after 2 months of elections, a result was declared. Mohammed Morsi narrowly won with 51% of the vote. The narrow majority had opposed Shafiq because they saw him as too closely linked with Mubarak. Morsi benefited electorally from this desire for change.
أقسم بالله العظيم أن أحافظ مخلصا على النظام الجمهوري.
But the anti-Shafiq vote was an uncomfortable coalition that would be severely tested almost as soon as Morsi took office. For the time being at least, and momentously, after almost 18 months of military government, the reins of power were handed over from the SCAF to the new president. By August, his cabinet was sworn in, and a new political era had begun. However, almost as soon as he became president, Mohammed Morsi began to assume increased powers. The first of these was after less than 2 weeks, when he requested the resignation of the head of the armed forces.
إحالة السيد المشير محمد حسين طنطاوي سليمان القائد العام للقوات المسلحة.
In late November, President Morsi further tightened his control by unilaterally granting himself almost unlimited powers. Morsi claimed that this was necessary to protect the revolution.
Opposition leaders in Egypt are calling for a 1 million-man march in the coming hours to protest against what they say is a coup by President Mohammed Morsi. He announced a new decree giving himself sweeping powers. These include control of the judiciary. It's also called for the retrial of those charged with killing or injuring protesters during the revolution.
Many people had started to feel that they had simply replaced one dictator with another. The gap between people and president widened in the coming months as they repeatedly called on him to give back his increased power, calls that Morsi resisted.
يدعو المجتمعون جماهير شعبنا للنزول غدا الجمعة 23 أو 20 من نوفمبر وكافة ميادين مصر للنزول في المليونية حاشدة في ميدان التحرير وكافة ميادين مصر بهدف إسقاط هذا الإعلان الدستوري.
12 months into his presidency, on the first anniversary of the election, thousands of Morsi opponents massed in cities around the country demanding his resignation.
On the anniversary of his taking office, the opposition insists it wants Morsi out of the presidential palace. But the president's camp says he's no pharaoh and that he's got the constitution on his side. The Egyptian revolution turning into a debate about what exactly defines democracy.
In response, in Nasser city, to the east of Cairo, Morsi supporters set up a sit-in camp outside the Rabaa al-Adawiya mosque. A similar camp was erected in Giza to the west at Al-Nada Square. On the 1st of July, as mass demonstrations continued, the army again played a crucial role. Its attitude hardened, and it decided it was time to act against the president. General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, Egypt's military chief, issued Morsi with a final ultimatum.
إن القوات المسلحة تعيد وتكرر الدعوة لتلبية مطالب الشعب وتمهل الجميع 48 ساعة كفرصة أخيرة لتحمل أعباء الظرف التاريخي الذي يمر به الوطن.
We never lost confidence in our army. We've always trusted that our army will be with us.
The army wanted to replace Morsi with an interim government, revise his constitution, and call new elections within a year. Morsi's response was defiant. He made a dramatic speech pledging to defend his legitimacy and vowing not to step down. He was calling the army's bluff.
لا يملك أحد الحق على الإطلاق كائنا من كان أن يستخدم أي نوع من أنواع الكلام أو القوة لا قدر الله أو غير ذلك لكي ينفذ أو يوجد شرعية أخرى لا بديل عن الشرعية الدستورية.
Morsi's election victory a year before had been a narrow one. By now, many swing voters had deserted him, and he relied almost entirely on the Muslim Brotherhood for support. On the 3rd of July, the military went through with its ultimatum. General el-Sisi announced that Morsi had been deposed and replaced by Supreme Court Chief Justice Adli Mansour.
يؤدي رئيس المحكمة الدستورية العليا اليمين أمام الجمعية العامة للمحكمة إجراء انتخابات رئاسية مبكرة على أن يتولى رئيس المحكمة الدستورية العليا إدارة شؤون البلاد خلال المرحلة الانتقالية ولحين انتخاب رئيس جديد.
In response, at the protest camp at the Rabaa al-Adawiya mosque, thousands more supporters of Morsi gathered in a show of unity for their deposed president. The following day, Mansour was sworn in as interim president.
أقسم بالله العظيم أن أحافظ مخلصا على النظام الجمهوري وأن أحترم الدستور والقانون.
In turn, he dissolved the lower house of parliament, the Shura Council, where religion-based parties had had a solid majority. The demonstrations supporting Morsi continued, demanding his reinstatement. Clashes erupted in Cairo and Alexandria. 36 people died in the clashes. The ousting of Morsi was described as a military coup by the Muslim Brotherhood. Some foreign governments grappled with this ousting of a democratically elected leader.
Well, we are evaluating how the authorities are responding to and handling the current situation.
We have determined legally we do not need to make a determination as to whether it is a coup or not a coup.
The Muslim Brotherhood's supreme guide, Mohammed Badir, claimed that millions of protesters would stay mobilized until Morsi's return. In the following days, more than 50 pro-Morsi protesters were killed by soldiers at a sit-in in front of the Republican Guard headquarters. interim government was sworn in that contained no religious-based parties. As pro-Morsi camps continued to grow, General el-sisi called on the people on the 24th of July to give him a mandate to stop what he called potential terrorism by Morsi and his supporters.
بطلب من المصريين طلب يوم الجمعة الجاية لابد من نزول كل المصريين الشرفاء الأمناء ينزلوا ليه؟ ينزلوا عشان يدوني تفويض وأمر بإني أواجه العنف والإرهاب المحتمل.
Two developments then escalated the conflict. First, prosecutors announced an investigation into Morsi and his government over allegations of murder. And then the army reached out for support to groups like the main Salafi party Al-Noor, the Copts, Mohammed el-Baradei and his Dastur party, and the grassroots Tamarod movement to present a united front against Morsi supporters. On the 27th of July, an estimated 80 people were killed by security forces and armed civilians during clashes at the camp outside of the mosque in Nasser City, Cairo. This simply exacerbated the polarization between pro and anti-Morsi supporters. Egypt was now completely divided, and the risk of civil war greater than ever. International diplomatic efforts were made, first by the EU and then by the Americans.
That all of the parties involved have a responsibility to be inclusive, to work towards a peaceful resolution. The last thing that we want is more violence. Egypt needs to get back to a new normal. And we will work very, very hard, together and with others, in order to bring parties together to find a peaceful resolution that grows the democracy and respects the rights of everybody.
But Cairo and the major cities remained on a short fuse. On the 7th of August, the interim presidency announced that diplomatic efforts to resolve the standoff with the Muslim Brotherhood had failed.
أود أن أصارحكم بأن تلك الجهود لم تحقق النجاح المأمول رغم الدعم الكامل الذي وفرته الحكومة المصرية.
Having held back their forces during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, the government now planned to crack down on the pro-Morsi demonstrations. On the 11th of August, with tensions rising, the security forces announced that they would move in on the pro-Morsi camps unless they dispersed within 24 hours. The deadline passed, as the camps were reinforced by thousands of supporters and the positions fortified.
With every passing day, the fortifications inside the camp are strengthened, as is the resolve of the protesters living in there, making it almost impossible to clear the site peacefully.
The stage was set for a large-scale confrontation. At 7 a.m. on the 14th of August, riot police carried out their threat to dismantle the pro-Morsi camps.
We're going to some breaking news out of Egypt now, out of Cairo. We're getting reports that security forces are moving in on protesters camped out in the Nasser City district. Army tanks are reportedly closing in on protesters. We're hearing that tear gas may have been used on the crowd.
The protesters tried to stop the armoured invasion. The security forces surrounded the camps. Many men, women and children remained and were caught up in the ensuing violence. Amid the tear gas and noise of the operation, shots were fired. The demonstrators said the police deliberately targeted them. The police, however, said that these shots came from within the camp.
Yes, yes. Look, look.
From a rooftop overlooking the camp at Rabaa al-Adawiya, an Al Jazeera camera crew found itself in the crossfire.
At about 7 o'clock, shots came into this position, narrowly missing several of our colleagues. A sustained burst of automatic fire. Everyone scrambled.
Estimates of the death toll in the clearing of the camps vary. While first denying that they'd used lethal force, the interim government claimed the number of dead at 194, while Morsi supporters claimed more than 10 times that figure. Among those killed was Asma el-Beltagi, daughter of Mohammed Beltagi, the Secretary General of the Freedom and Justice Party, affiliated to the Muslim Brotherhood. He'd become a public figure and was a regular fixture on stage at Rabaa. The clearing of the camp set off retaliatory clashes and protest marches around the country. A number of police stations and government offices were attacked. 43 police were killed. Churches and Christian property were also attacked, because the Copts were now seen by Morsi supporters as being aligned with the military government. The Interior Minister made a statement announcing that the security forces would no longer allow sit-ins anywhere in the country. The military introduced a nighttime curfew across the country. Pro-Morsi supporters organised what they called a Day of Rage on the 16th of August, and once again, violent clashes hit Cairo. The Fatah Mosque near Ramses Square was transformed into a makeshift hospital and a refuge for hundreds of protesters.
There was blood sticking to our shoes as we went up the pink marble steps. Got inside, there was about an acre of mosque in which there were just wounded, moaning and crying, and paramedics trying to save them. And at the corner of the mosque beyond, to the left, there were lined up on the floor bodies in white shrouds.
Refusing to leave the mosque for fear of violence from police and an angry mob, they barricaded themselves inside. Intense gunfire peppered the mosque. The army later claimed it was because they had come under fire. With fighting still on the streets, presidential advisor Mustafa Hegazi appeared on television to make an extraordinary claim.
But Egyptians today are more united than has been ever before. We will combat extremism, and we will combat terrorism.
The Muslim Brotherhood Supreme Guide, Mohammed Badir, was arrested. He faces charges of inciting violence and murder, and suffered a heart attack in custody. Amidst the chaos, the man whose departure effectively triggered this whole chain of events was temporarily released from jail and flown by helicopter to a military hospital. He still has to stand trial on charges of corruption and the killing of protesters during the 2011 revolution. Mohammed Morsi and Mohammed Beltagi also await trial along with more than a dozen senior members of the Muslim Brotherhood. 2.5 years after the fall of Mubarak, many of the restrictions on freedom that he imposed have been reintroduced. Censorship has crept back into the media. Under Morsi's rule, 6 journalists were charged with insulting the president or Islam. The night Morsi was deposed, 5 TV channels considered sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood were shut down. And since July 2013, journalists have been arrested, though some have since been released. Since the crackdowns and curfew, protests and demonstrations have continued. The plan now put forward by the Mansour government is for new elections within the next 12 months. But in a country so divided, the fundamental question is as to whether any democratically elected leadership can now really deliver sustained and effective government. Some go further and ask what democracy in Egypt really means. Can stability be restored in a way that enables ordinary Egyptians to regain hard-earned freedoms and rebuild their lives, their economy, and a lasting future?